It is one of my two favorite conferences. One is Rendering Workshop, one is this, and they go back and forth. But my favorite thing about this conference is the undercurrent is studying things that work, which most conferences don't. So, and I'm a fan of things that work, which is one reason I've gone to a game company. So this talk, I gave the title to force myself to do this homework, because until a year ago, I was not a real-time graphics person. And I've gotten really a deep immersion in it, and I don't really know where it came from, because when this stuff was going on, I was doing other things. Now granted, the first part of this talk will be stuff I am familiar with, because a lot of 60 FPS graphics is just batch graphics from 30 years ago, made fast by hardware. So this passed the University of Utah, and this is not that long ago. That's how young our field is. And the part of the past, I'm not going to do a full coverage. I'm going to only cover things that people actually use. So like the saber-tooth tiger, it's super cool. That tooth innovation algorithm didn't work out, didn't last, wouldn't cover it. The risk of that is if this were an AI talk 10 years ago, I wouldn't mention neural nets. So it's a little risky, but I'll just talk about things we use now. A lot of our graphics history really comes from film and TV, and this is an awesome book which I have finally read. He really goes into depth, so get ready when you read this and sit down and concentrate. But it is a wealth of information I did not know about where did the roots of our field come from. And first of all, here's like the first graphics in my mind, which is when they said, hey, let's do this moving picture stuff. Empirically, how many frames per second was needed to make the illusion of motion happen? And the empirical answer was 16 frames per second. And then they had to figure out a way to project this on some kind of medium. And this is a remarkable engineering device, something that shows you a frame for about a 16th of a second, and then advances so you don't see the blur. So some shutter mechanism has to happen. Go look at, if you aren't familiar with how those projectors work, go look at it. It's really an amazing piece of engineering. Like the sound is on the same film strip, but it's stepping along stopping. And so how would you design that? It's actually pretty hard to come up with. Probably true from the internet, though I can't fully verify this, these would flicker if it did 16 frames per second, and that's why they call them flicks. And the innovation was to just have the shutter go multiple times, so the strobing was at a different frequency than the actual film advance. Super KISS solution to this problem. And then we go to games. Where do games come from this? Well, games wanted more than 16 frames per second. The empirical result is story-based games are 30 frames per second. Some of that is due to the history of the television set and its natural frequencies. But about 30 FPS seems to be a good number. But there's a different part of graphics, which competitive video games and things like flight simulators are. They need 60 frames per second. That was kind of established by E&S with their flight simulators back in the day, and that was just an empirical result, and seems to have lasted. 60 frames seems to be kind of a sweet spot where it's good enough for your reaction in a simulation or in a game combat, but it's not so bad that you can't get a good image quality. And then let's just look at what's happened to movie and TV in the parallel evolution that is highly related to computer graphics, because we often use their displays, so there's some divergence. And where's that gone? And the surprising thing to me is 24, 48 frames per second has been tried. 24 frames per second really seems to be preferred empirically. And when people try to do more than that, it fails in the market. Now, maybe that doesn't mean it won't succeed in the market in 10 years, but just a quick survey. Who saw one of these high frame rate Hobbit or Avatar things? Unfortunately, I missed them. Who saw them and liked it better than traditional film? All right, I want to talk to you at the reception, because I want some fans, because I have no dog in this hunt, because I didn't see any of these things. I was just interested. Okay, let's switch to geometry. What's happened in geometry in the past? There are all these different things that have come along that people have tried. This will be the shortest part of the talk. Triangle 1. I never would have predicted this 30 years ago, because it's a really bloated representation. It's kind of awkward to tessellate something. We have higher order surfaces, which just will need more computation but less bandwidth. That seems like it's a good future trend. Man, those triangles have staying power. So we'll discuss that no more. How about the graphics pipeline? This, to me, is the OG of computer graphics. This is Larry Roberts. Quick survey, who's heard of Larry Roberts? I think this is a crime. I think this should be who we talk about first in computer science. And he should have won 2 Turing Awards, or maybe 3. So here's from his 1963 dissertation at MIT, same year I was born. And look at that set of matrices. This dude isn't even a graphics guy. He's doing computer vision, and he pulls that out of somewhere. I have not tracked down like what the source for that is, and did anyone use matrices first? So I'd be interested to hear. Quick digression, anything incomplete or wrong in this talk, I want to hear about it. I will iterate. This is version 1.0, so I'll iterate this. But if you look at this guy's Wikipedia page, he is the father of computer vision. And if you look farther down the Wikipedia page, he is the father of the internet, because he really pushed packet switching networks, both technologically and deploying them. Like, he made that happen politically. And he did this. So I would argue he has a good candidate for father of computer graphics. And no Turing Award. So if you're ever complaining you don't get enough recognition, man, just think of Larry Roberts. Now then, a lot of the algorithms that underlie current real-time graphics were done as batch algorithms back in the day. Most of them at the University of Utah in this ugly old building, which I've worked in before. And this is not a great building. But Ivan Sutherland, pictured here with Dave Evans, he said that through his long, successful career, his experience empirically is that the quality of work done is inversely proportional to the quality of the space. So when somebody in your organization proposes that, oh, we were so successful, we should build a new monument to ourselves in the form of building, say, no, scholarships, let's do that instead. And we got all these familiar pictures of various things, bump mapping, et cetera, out of that amazing time at Utah. But there was some stuff going on other places than Utah, like the first physically based rendering paper, in my opinion, was this BRDF paper from Cook back in the day, which he did at Cornell. And the backstory on that is he's like, wow, I needed to look at light reflection. I'll go find out who on campus knows about light reflection. And he went down to another building and found Ken Torrance. So if you're a student, go looking for somebody on campus that knows something you don't. It's a lot easier than reading books. So here's the summary. Here are the golden age inventions. And the part that surprised me the most is the cosine raised to a power highlights were being done commonly at Utah in the late 60s, and were first done apparently by a fellow named Romney. Fong did normal interpolation. So in preparing this, I was like, surely I know these things, but no, there was some basic stuff. And that was in Garreau's paper, so it wasn't like an obscure thing that this was being done. Who already knew this, that cosine raised to a power predated Fong? Okay, I'll buy you a beer. One person. All of these things are just used commonly in real-time games now. So it's interesting how much staying power these things had, given how much has changed in computer science. Another candidate for, I guess he did win a Turing Award, so we can't say he was underappreciated. It's Catmull in one thesis did Z-buffer, subdivision surfaces, and texture mapping. So that's unbelievable. And one of the members of his committee wanted to stop him from doing sub-Ds because that was clearly such a bad idea. And Catmull won that argument by removing him from his dissertation committee. So remember, KISS algorithms work. And then ray tracing came along. That obviously is used commonly in interactive applications. And if you have enough hardware, 60 frames per second, no problem. Whitted, also Kay did this in a master's thesis around the same time. Whitted did the more complete implementation, so he usually gets credit, and I think deservedly so. And then Cook came along and said, let's add a call to random number generator in Whitted's ray tracing program. What's interesting here, too, is if you read Cook's paper, he said he got the idea from Whitted's paper. And I'm like, he did? I thought I read Whitted's paper. But there's a little bit in Whitted's paper. Look at that random thing. He's talking about randomly perturbing rays from surfaces in that 1980 paper. It's just amazing. So read papers carefully. Often they will just give you gold in there. That 1980 paper also had bounding volume hierarchies. That's just incredible. It's an incredible paper. And then the physically based rendering stuff from Cook with BRDFs started this movement at Cornell to really dig into the physics, and they were talking about, hey, let's look at light interreflection, not just for mirrors, but also diffuse surfaces. And this also was the second paper I'm aware of. There was actually a super old Utah paper that had this, that actually tried to do a comparison with the real photo. That very brave thing to do. And that spurned a radiosity feeding frenzy that's kind of like the NeRF thing now, where there was just a ton of radiosity papers. And the advantage of radiosity at the time was, hey, we have these Gaussian triangles on hardware. We can just spit out the illumination at the vertices of these things and just do Gaussian shading. And a lot of that was pursued to try and reduce the number of triangles. So this is just a particular radiosity mesh where, though it's stored in the mesh, is not geometry, but the illumination at the vertices. And you can see that there's more tessellation, like in the shadow regions. And where there's a contact shadow, there's a lot of meshing. So there's a lot of work done on that back in the day. And that hasn't lasted so much. But what has lasted is baking. So this is saying, hey, let's pre-compute this lighting, put it on the diffuse surfaces, and not recompute it as we change our viewpoint. And baking is just a great trick. There is baking in real life. So you can always take illumination and replace it with albedo, and no one will know the difference. It's just a classic imposter strategy we use all the time in graphics. What looks the same as this real thing, but is faster to render. So these are real photos. Some artist like painted a shadow, remarkably convincing. This is the Samsung frame, which is a TV that has a light sensor, and when you put it in screensaver mode, and it's very flat, it tries to make itself look like a reflective surface with a certain pattern for that light level. And it's not perfect because its sensor is not quite good enough, but if you tune it, it really looks like a reflective surface in real life. So this imposter thing, I think we should often think more about what environment are we actually building? We're doing a physically accurate representation of some imposter environment that looks the same. Often, I think, leads to a cleaner way of thinking about the algorithm. Okay, baking is more usually done with texture maps, illumination maps. This is the first one I could find, which is Jim Arvo back in the 80s did this paper with illumination maps, and he did it, of course, for caustics, which would be way too slow to do interactively. Still, that's a super challenge now. The trouble with baking on surfaces is you would like, in many circumstances, to have dynamic objects walk through a baked environment. Like if you baked this room, then you had a character walk through. The character wouldn't affect the room so much, but you ought to have the room affect the character. And so you can bake into a volume. This is a commonly used technique now, so that you just query a 3D texture, essentially, to look something up. The way this is done at Activision, by the way, is being presented tomorrow in Natasha's course tomorrow afternoon by Michael Ivanicki. I think he's very close to solve the light leak problem. Like, we're not going to look into that anymore. I think that finally is nailed enough. Super cool method, so you should check out his talk tomorrow afternoon. Okay, interactive ray tracing, that was first done, to my knowledge, 4 frames per second, so we're being a little generous, by Mike Moose at the Army Research Lab. Some of you old timers remember BRLCAD, the first distributed on the internet ray tracer, I think. Who's used BRLCAD here? Anybody? Okay, we're going to have old timers reunion. And who knows what Mike Moose is better known for? Sadly, he was killed in a car accident, and he's no longer with us. Yes. Ping, that's right. This guy wrote Ping. So he did the first interactive ray tracer and Ping. I'm impressed. I know what I would have on my tombstone if I were him. And then someone said, hey, yeah, sure, Mike Moose, you can do this with like $100 million computer, we'll do it on a PC. In fact, I think 3 of the authors of this paper are in this room, right? Can you raise your hand? 1, there's Philip. 2? Yeah, well, and this was a very impressive paper because it was like 5 years sooner than any of us thought would happen. And that really, I think, changed the bits in some of our brains for like, how fast could you do this? And then Philip's same lab did this thing of, well, what if you had special purpose hardware? Let's take an FPGA and just run it. And it ran interactively on this one FPGA. It was super impressive, which kind of demonstrated if you did have special purpose hardware, ray tracing could run very efficiently on it. And then the real key invention to make interactive ray tracing practical, since you really want Monte Carlo ray tracing, not just ray tracing because you want diffuse interreflection, is you need denoising. So this took me quite a while of archaeology with Google Scholar. Who did the first let's denoise a path tracer paper? I have a candidate. Does anyone know? This is my candidate. So if you can find an earlier one, I want to hear about it. Henrik Jensen did it back in the day, and all of us were offended because it added bias. Clearly a bad idea. So I would say one of the biggest, I think it cost us 5 years in the research community that we Monte Carlo people viewed bias as a bad thing. If we could have removed that, Puritan block from our head, we would have gone a lot faster. Henrik apparently didn't have it. And then along came ambient occlusion. This to me is like kind of a meteor in that it was completely offensive to the physically based rendering people. It's just a hack that darkens in the corners, but it actually looks better than the correct physics because it also kind of looks like you're putting dirt in the corners, so it like fixes these models. And it was actually called obscurance in this original paper. I'm not sure who coined ambient occlusion. I kind of like obscurance though, so it's not a bad term. And that to me kind of told us not only is bias sometimes a good idea, but just completely incorrect physics that accomplishes the task is a good idea. Then I would say this next candidate, I'm giving a tentative, it's had a big influence, but we're still early on this idea. This is coming up in a lot of places. It's a super clever idea, a nice simple hammer that just is good. If you haven't read this, I suggest you take a look at it, because if you're like me, where you read these modern graphics papers, I'm author on some of them, and you just see all these integral equations, you say, wow, I wish I were doing something else. This paper's kind of nice, and it's kind of old school. Let's use some simple math to really accomplish some good stuff. Okay, that's graphics algorithms. Now let's talk about materials. So materials we've always had a rough relationship with because the models don't really have all the right properties, but if they do have the right properties, they're too complicated. If we use microfacets for real, it's a pain. And then Brent Burley came along, and he implemented all of the reflection models papers. I mean, literally all of them. Looked at the Merle database to see what worked, ran things back to the artists, and then wrote this paper. And what year is this? 2012. So this is now a 12-year-old paper, and as far as I know, 100% of graphics people are basically using this method. I've never seen something take over the field more rapidly. Every video game, every movie, all the graphics APIs use this model. And here's the model if you're not familiar with it. There are 4 kinds of materials in the world. There's a diffuse and specular one, and if you want just diffuse, turn off the specular. That's that pot. There's metal, there's glass, and there's everything else. The everything else is the kitchen sink component of the model and kind of the weakest part, but the everything else we mostly don't care about unless it's skin. And so that everything else thing, I think there's still some work to do. Usually subsurface scattering is your biggest issue more than exactly what that surface term is. But this just works. And then further, he said, hey, instead of having a category of 4 different models, we'll just do this very complicated mixture of all four of these things. And it's not just mixing, it's a layer-based mixture model, and it's very complicated, and nothing is all four of these things. So this is a little offensive at first, but in practice, this is just what works. So if you look at old school renderers, say from 80s, 90s, they use different categories of material and have different, more efficient implementations. Almost all modern implementations have every single material all mixed together with some weird kludgy stuff. And that's usually called an Uber shader. And it's just taken over, so I've just accepted this now, even though at some level I don't like it, it works. As far as I can tell, the first Uber shader was Sing Fu at which studio? Some studio. None of this is documented, so that's oral tradition. If someone knows who thinks they did the first Uber shader, I'd like to hear about it, because that was a super influential idea that we just haven't tracked in our field. That Sheen term, the kitchen sink term, Brent wasn't fully satisfied with, and neither was anybody else. So Sony did an improved one, at least they thought so, and their artists thought so. And then Brent has, well, not Brent, Brent and some of his colleagues have done a still yet more improved Sheen term. I have not implemented the Sony or new Disney term. If any of you have, I'd like to hear about it. That's one of my side projects. At some point, I'd like to know, so is this good enough? And notice, linear transform cosines. So that gets to go in there. So that's a bunch of algorithms and BRDFs and 5,000 modeling papers where I had one slide that says triangles win. Then we started, like right now, if you look at a lot of what we see today, it's Monte Carlo rendering that's denoised. So where did that really start? That did not start from the ray tracing people, that started from the ReSTIR people. So they started taking taps, random taps, using rasterization, and that produced a noisy rendering, but one that was a very Monte Carlo one. And so I was off doing ray tracing at this time when this all went down, and I think this is of the last, say, 20 years. So in this millennium, the most important thing that happened in rendering is this raster-based do taps, do TAA, do denoising thing. And we don't really know where it came from, because none of it was from the academic community. It all came from the games community. So it was published, and so I spent about 2 weeks asking around Activision and other game companies, like, who did this first? Who did screen space taps first? As far as I can tell, after 2 weeks, it was done by my boss in the next office first, along with some of her colleagues, and published in these books I don't own. So this is one reason I think like the provenance on where these ideas came from is a little sketchy, because the games community published in strange places that the university people like me at the time didn't read. And so this, as far as I can tell, were the first papers doing depth of field and haze, but it was too slow. So it was like a very advanced technique that didn't quite work in practice. At least it didn't have a high enough frame rate. But around the same time, temporal anti-aliasing came along, an idea that I thought was just terrible, because let's say 1987 to 2007, there are dozens of failed projects trying to do time coherence between frames. It's a very attractive idea. And didn't work. But then someone started getting just the right mojo together to get it to work. This, thankfully, there is some provenance on because of a nice survey paper that was done. And as far as I know, these are the first 2 papers that did TAA back in the day. For those of you that don't know it, it just means, hey, don't just render a picture. Take the last several frames and blend them in with this picture. So this picture might just contribute 1/10 of this pixel to what's happened before it, and keep track of like camera motion and object motion so you can mix all of this together and hope the artifacts aren't too bad. It works way better than anyone expected. I think 100% of video games use this now. That may be wrong, but a lot of them do. And so the ideas from Natasha and her cohort in the previous slide, that started getting applied to other dimensions. And then it came out in games. And as far as I can tell, these are the first 2 places that actually produced a workable algorithm that you could do, well, 30 frames per second. Back in what year is this? 2007, 2008. There were other ideas from this Crytek engine, like I think this was the first thing to do effective screen space ray tracing, but I'm not positive about that. But this is where like the super hardcore Monte Carlo people, one was in raster graphics first for interactive applications anyway, and still winning. So this is, to me, this is like the culmination of a super incredible period of computer graphics research that most of us just weren't that aware of. It just happened off in that community that was not publishing in SIGGRAPH. I don't know if they were submitting, but they weren't publishing. Then another idea that was similar is, well, if you can do TAA, why not blur spatially too? And here's a paper, Alexander Reshetov, you're here probably still. Did you stay for my talk? I'm gonna be angry if you didn't, okay. And this was a paper I was like, that works really well, but won't it have terrible dynamic artifacts? Again, like we really anticipate a lot of trouble that once you tune things right, we didn't have. And so here's a paper that combines the TAA and the spatial anti-aliasing, and that's kind of the grandfather of things like DLSS that we have today. So this was news to me because I wasn't attending this much to this industry at the time. Blurred Monte Carlo rendering was already common in 10 years ago. Then this company called NVIDIA came along and made effective ray tracing hardware. And then there was a AAA game that, as far as I know, this is the first AAA game with widespread or like, ubiquitous ray tracing in it. And, specular reflection, I'm sorry, it just doesn't excite me that much. So this one I was like, oh, that's super cool, but where's my diffuse bounce? But soon enough, it came along in this game, which I've heard is a good game. So it's on my list to like someday actually play. It sounds dystopian enough for my taste. And I think it's set in like 2030 or something, which is pretty funny. The bounce you see on the ceiling there is from the illuminated patches down below. So they're actually doing a one bounce path trace here. Very effective. Okay, one last thing from the past. Another thing that came in from the side is, you do this physically based rendering. And by the way, almost all movies and games now are physically based, even if their final goal is not absolute realism. That's just kind of interesting and, to me, unanticipated. But you need to tone map this sucker at the end, which means you need some form of perceptual optimization, either empirical or from science. So I'm like, oh, okay, so you do some kind of tone mapping where you have a model of the human visual system and you optimize the display given it's a low dynamic range. I'm thinking, this is a very modern idea. Like, who had that first? And I thought it was like Tumblin and Rushmeyer back in the 90s, but where was it? Anyone know? This one kind of blew me away. What? It might be, but the earliest I know is this one from University of Utah in the early 70s. It's unbelievable. He took a human visual model and he did dodging and burning basically to take the high dynamic range negative down to a low dynamic range positive. And this was Jim Kajia's advisor, and if you look in Jim Kajia's dissertation, it's like a big, giant human visual system model that stemmed from this kind of thinking. Then, I think this was largely forgotten in our industry, sadly, but it was revisited by Jack Tumblin and Holly Rushmeyer, and this is the diagram that I still think of when I think of tone mapping. And that was the thinking in tone mapping for many years. Let's actually use, and this is a very academic way of approaching it, it's the way I approached it. Let's take a mathematical model of the human visual system and optimize the output for that. And the problem is the mathematical model of the human visual systems kind of suck. And so you end up with a fairly limited thing. And what almost all of these perception graphics works do, including all of mine, is you say, oh, apply this cool model. Oh, but we have some knobs to tweak. And then you use your n=1 experiment in your own system to get something that you like. And so I think now people are more leaning into, let's cut out the middleman and just steal from the artists. They've been doing this for 100 years. They have a bunch of standard practices. And that's now what's done in most tone mapping, is you just take what the film industry did and steal it. And it seems to be working pretty well. So that wraps up the past. That's my whirlwind tour of the past. Where do we stand now? So here is our present. This was my favorite meme from the last 4 years. And let's go to what screens do people use right now? So here's where people look at images. Now what's interesting to me is they don't look at stereo at all. And this was very disappointing to me a couple years ago at NVIDIA. I wanted to do a stereo demo. I could not buy a stereo machine, or a stereo screen for any amount of money. 10 years ago, I could have walked into any Best Buy and had a choice of 3 different manufacturers' stereo screen. So I think stereo to the consumer is something we can say we very confidently have done an experiment to determine they don't seem to want it, which is disappointing to me personally, but everything else is on the line here. The phone is particularly confusing because the screen is small, and VR is particularly confusing because it's just a different paradigm of looking at stuff. So let's go to gaming on these devices. Almost all games are now 30 FPS or 60 FPS, and that seems remarkably stable. And the fractions of games that are 60 FPS is smaller than when I joined NVIDIA first in 2008. So what is that? 16 years ago, computing has improved a factor of 1 million. The frame rate has stayed the same, and the fraction they're doing 30 FPS has gone up. This would have been very surprising to me if you told me that at the time, but that's very interesting. What's also interesting is people prefer 24 frame per second films. Like you go watch an old film, it's pretty low dynamic range, it's dim, but man, they look really good for some reason. Is that because the medium is so well established that that they have great practices for 24, so it's in some local minimum of production? Or do we have natural frequencies, and maybe our cinematics in games should be 24, not 30? Has anyone tried this, by the way? I was thinking someone must have tried this, because you get the motion blur right, you get 24 frames per second. Most consumers now own a screen that will go 120 hertz, so that divides evenly with 24, so you could do this. Would it look better? And so one question is just, that seems weird. Do we have natural frequencies, really? And I only recently learned that this was a thing. In fact, Chris Wyman here in the audience, I was talking to him about this, is this work? And he said, well, that would explain moire patterns that you see in real life. And I'm like, dude, you need an MRI or something. You see moire patterns in real life? You see like wagon wheel effect? And he's like, oh yeah. And so I started reading, and a lot of people see wagon wheel effect in real life, which I did not realize. One circumstance where it happens is you're riding in a car and it's bumping along and so your eyeballs are physically bouncing, and that can cause some wagon wheel effect for the car next to you. But it also happens people are totally still. And it turns out the psych people have been arguing about this for like 50 years, and I was just unaware of the argument. This is the most recent readable paper I have been able to find. And so apparently there are circumstances where we do see natural frequency effects as if we have some Hertz thing going on our head. And it's an argument why it occurs. Some of the psych people think, yes, it's true, but it's nothing deep here. It's because your skull has a certain radius and there's certain literally speeds that things are traveling, and so you end up with a natural frequency. But I think this would be a very interesting thing is, does 24 look better than 30 if you do everything right? And if you have a 120 hertz monitor and are a very good graphics programmer, I think you could do this experiment. There's some other questions I have too about the present, like, why are movies so dim? They could be a lot brighter. I don't think I'd like it. Is it just because I don't want to see the rest of the people in the audience? If you made it any brighter, it wouldn't be that movie experience. I don't know. Why are TVs still dimmish? So the current TVs are about 400 nits. Plenty of people have demonstrated TVs at 4,000 nits. They're very producible. You can cool them. Nobody seems to want them. And when I've seen them, they look really good. So is it because they consume too much power? Do they cost too much to manufacture because they're just more expensive? I don't know the answer, but I've had a 4,000 nit TV and a 1,000 nit TV in the same lab, and the 4,000 nit TV just looks better. And neither of them are like excessively bright. Maybe it's you don't want to watch them for 4 hours. It could be as simple as that. But I find this very confusing. The 16,000 nits is the brightest screen I have seen, and it looked good. So this is just a mystery to me, why the TVs haven't gotten brighter. Okay, and where do people render their graphics now? All over the map is the answer. It's like the range of platforms that we have has never been wider. And there's a issue of just install base. So I've drawn this graph by hand because I couldn't get accurate enough data, and I want to just indicate this graph is BS. But it's reasonably right in the broad strokes. So I didn't label them also. I want you to take a guess. On the y-axis is billions of people that own one of these devices, or really more accurately, the number of these devices that are owned by people, because burner phones are a thing. If you know someone that owns 4 phones, you should probably find new friends. On the x-axis is year. And so what is the thing on the bottom, the thing with the lowest install base? Your hint is their consoles, their PCs, and their phones. That's what's up here. I guess mobile devices, more accurately. So what's the bottom one? Consoles. And it's up to around 1 billion or so. How about the next one you can guess is PCs, 2 billion. And then phones is more than there are humans. And it's obviously the first one that's like saturating the market. So phones are a very, very important device and will probably remain so, because I doubt 500-watt phones will ever be practical. This has real implications for rendering budget. The PC and console, though, are still going up, so it may just be that people don't do 60 frames per second graphics on their phones 10 years from now. Who knows? It's really hard to predict these things. Another thing, when I first got to NVIDIA in 2008, the conventional wisdom was PC gaming was dead, consoles will be 100% of the market. Didn't happen, probably because of Steam, but who knows why. So, predictions are hard. But if everybody has a phone, then everyone can have graphics, and then graphics are democratized. There's some implications of this that are a little uncomfortable for a hardcore rendering person, which is, most of these devices will kind of suck from a graphic standpoint. So maybe we ought to back off on high levels of realism. But I want that, shadow to be perfectly anti-aliased and soft and beautiful. Well, maybe the good news is different devices can just have a different call for that shadow algorithm. So the way we decompose lighting may solve some of this. But there's a real image quality versus how many users you get trade-off here. This is just uncomfortable for me personally, because I've always wanted as much hardware as possible, because raise per second is what I want. So if we have this democratized graphics, and most of it is games, which I didn't say, but it's true, you don't want realism, you want like entertainment. And so this is a scene from the game we released in October. Like, this is really from just a rendered video game going out to the whole world. This isn't realistic exactly. It's much more cinematographic. Is that a word? It's much more supposed to be beautiful and engaging, like a film. And so things are exaggerated, like the tone mapping, some of the color grading. And yet, all of the assets in this game and every other game I'm aware of are totally physically based. Like, the artists measure the stuff, the albedos are right, the BRDF and microfacet distributions are right. Why is that? That seemed like a funny thing. And the roots of that are from predictive rendering, where, like the Omniverse project at NVIDIA, where they need to have the car not only look realistic, but really look like the real car that is eventually manufactured. Predictive rendering needs all of that physically based stuff. The renderer at Activision that produces Call of Duty looks almost exactly like one of those predictive renderers. And that just seems strange to me because it's so expensive and you want stuff to run on phones. So that's just a confusing thing I'll address a little bit in the future. Okay, that brings us to the present. Let me just comment that I think this is the most interesting time to have been in graphics of the time I've been in graphics. So many people think graphics research peaked in 1984. Like you look at SIGGRAPH 84, it's just amazing what's in there. And then I joined in 85. So it's been all downhill for me. But I think right now is when it's most interesting. We have no idea what graphics algorithms are going to look like in 5 years. So what is the future going to be? And for the next 10 years or so, I think I know. That's the future. And let's look now at a bunch of stuff. I said that I was only going to look at the survivors and the saber-toothed tiger part of the talk. Now I'm going to look at the stuff that didn't make it but seemed like a really good idea. And I think we should revisit all of them. One is point-based graphics. You know, the NeRF stuff at some level is kind of point-based graphics. Gaussian splatting has a lot in common with it. Points are super attractive. Triangles keep getting smaller. That was the whole point of point-based graphics back in the day. Once triangles are sub-pixel, why do you have 3 vertices? You should just keep a point. And this was such a popular idea, there was actually 4 of these point-based rendering conferences, and then it died. Who went to one of those? I actually went to one. Yeah, I guess the people that went to it died too. Should we be in graphics doing just some kind of crude graphics that doesn't look that good, and then doing style transfers? Just have a big honking neural net that does not just denoise, but hallucinates. And this was a super cool paper out of Intel that just said, let's take Grand Theft Auto images and then train it with real driving video and make it real. So this is a very likely outcome, if we were betting, that graphics will get worse and worse and worse, and we'll use very crude graphics and then enhance it with a super denoiser that just hallucinates, say, the indirect lighting, whatever. This is a lot harder. Like, I actually expected, after I saw this Grand Theft Auto paper, I was like, oh, in a couple of years, this will just be the way we do things. It turned out to somehow be harder than was expected. Denoising has a lot of nice statistical properties and somehow is more tractable than hallucination. Hallucination is dangerous. Is ReSTIR just going to take over the world? It has like a very fresh way of looking at things, and just every new paper, it's like, really? You can do that? So this is not an old idea that failed. This is an old idea that has not yet proven itself. But it's certainly very promising, and there's certainly a component of people, some in this room, that just think it's going to take over the world. Another thing that might take over the world is NeRFs. So I went to CVPR, the big computer vision conference, a month ago, and in the poster session, there were over 100 NeRF posters. So my reaction to it was to say, I'm going to skip to the next aisle. I think it's super cool, but I cannot keep up with the number of papers that's coming out. And this is just an amazingly elegant algorithm. There's a lot of progress on relighting it, which is really be the key for it to use in, say, a video game. And the thing I really like about it is its elegance and its compatibility with scanning, because it's really much easier to scan now. So what may win in the end is whatever is best for dealing with scanned data. How about voxels? We saw a nice paper for Antoine this morning. It brought a tear to my eye because I love this area. I feel like this ought to beat triangles. I've always thought that. I've always been wrong so far. But I keep wondering if this is like neural nets, where just the right thing will make this take over, because LOD is just the nightmare of any graphics system. And this is a very elegant LOD solution. It's very compatible with scanned data. I love its like brute force hammer approach to things, which triangles have shown us is just kind of a good idea engineering-wise. So the trouble with a lot of these voxel-based techniques is going the last mile, voxel-based artifacts. It seems like neural nets ought to be able to just take care of that, doesn't it? there is an issue with animated content. So there's a whole content pipeline thing that I do wonder, again, if we're in a local minimum of we have this whole production workflow thing, it's very hard to shift to something else right now. Okay, what about stereo? Speaking of abandoned ideas, I just said the public rejected this entirely. Aces and a couple other companies have this amazing technology that just tracks your eyes now so you don't have to put on glasses. It's single viewer, which is unfortunate, but this is the first stereo monitor I've seen where I was just like, oh wow, that's really good. So if you haven't seen one of these, take a look at them. You can, if you have a hardware budget, just order one of these laptops. They're not that expensive, and it's impressive. Like, I would love to play a tabletop game like Zoo Tycoon or something with this kind of technology. I gotta say, I don't want to watch a movie on it. Okay, how about just render on the cloud? That takes away all this mobile, I only have 10 watts thing going, and it works. Like, I went and bought a GeForce Now membership, which just let me hop in the queue. You currently can only use games you bought. But I played Call of Duty on this system, and it was friggin' awesome. So as far as I'm concerned, cloud gaming has been solved technologically. So it's just a question of societally or economically does it work, which is not my department. But it has certain implications, I think. When I sell you a GPU and you play a ray trace game, you pay your power bill of 500 watts. When I'm running a cloud business, I pay that power bill. But I also have full control over the hardware. Imagine that if you only had one hardware platform that you had to target as a software person, wouldn't that be beautiful? Okay, maybe this 60 hertz thing, is a bad idea. Maybe we just get rid of all of this complicated denoising and do something really simple and just have the eye denoise with like super high frame rates. Joseph here in the audience somewhere. Joseph, where are you? He's somewhere here. You didn't skip my talk, man. Okay. He has a super cool demo of this. It's a very compelling brute force idea. And the screens are getting much better. So just a little thing I didn't talk about too much is screens kind of didn't progress very well until like 10 years ago, and then suddenly, bam, screens got so much better so fast, and that continues. Okay, now here's a crazy idea that first came to me from Chris Wyman, which is, can we just stop computing visibility? We've been doing that for 50 years. It's been a big pain in the neck for 50 years. What if we just didn't do it? Because we have an AI post-process coming anyway, it can sort that out. If I were going to start a PhD thesis in rendering tomorrow, this is what I would work on. Keep in mind, most PhD theses turn out to be bad ideas. You can take some risks there. But I kind of feel like this is a crazy idea whose time may have come. And visibility is a pain in the ass. You still need to cull. So that's part of visibility. And maybe culling is hard enough that just getting rid of visibility and what's in frustum wouldn't matter that much. But all of these ideas that I've just talked about for the future, they are really revisiting old graphics algorithms, and with a new twist. Usually there's a neural net in there. A key thing is historically graphics and graphics algorithms have co-evolved, and the trouble is you need to convince a multi-billion-dollar company to build this chip. So it's become very hard to do this work in academics, although Eric Brundtland, who's here, did do quite a bit of the ray tracing hardware work. So you can do it with simulation if you have the right hardware infrastructure. I feel like we should be doing that more again, is saying what would bake into hardware best? Because really we have this general purpose GPU and this general purpose CPU. If Moore's law is over, maybe we should be doing special purpose something PUs that work for some rendering algorithm, and that's all it does. And that's certainly what these authors of that architecture book many of us had in school said in their Turing Award lecture is, now that Moore's law is over and we're getting better at fabricating and designing things, it's finally we're going to have special purpose hardware for something other than graphics. But I think we should also have it for graphics now that the GPUs do so much. So last thing in this talk is just a little observation of what rendering is. So what we have historically done is said, oh, let's do PBR rendering. Then it's too slow. And then we look at efficient rendering. and it's fast enough but isn't realistic. And so one thing we could do is just use AI to project into there. But what's done more in practice is we do some stuff that looks real. So we make up some physics. We say this is the physics we'll approximate. It's not complete. And we try to find something that's on the border. Now, there are a lot of other things out there that we're doing. And so you end up with all of this stuff, that's visually rich, it's this or that. And that gets back to, why do we do physically based rendering for all these things that don't need physically based rendering? And I think what you automatically get just as a sidecar on physically based rendering, you get consistent assets. That's why I think we use it for games like Call of Duty. You have 500 artists working together on gigantic models. If they all have to make real world assets, they will be a visually consistent set of assets. So good. You'll get visually rich lighting if you just use realistic lighting. You'll have, diffuse bounce looks good. You'll get good spatial cues so that you can tell where you're navigating in this virtual environment. And it's compelling. The real world's compelling. But do you really need all of that? Do you need physically based rendering to get that? No, there's probably ways to get this that are not fully physically based. And this is probably a good way for us to find efficiencies, but it will require a more subjective approach. Now, the one I've been thinking about quite a bit is visual cues. I think that's where ambient occlusion has been very helpful. You can really tell when something's touching. And this is some old work from Bill Thompson's group at Utah back in the day. And it's like anything works as a shadow, especially when it's dynamic. So that negative shadow there, that worked great as a spatial cue. That weird diffuse bounce that's orange, it worked great as a visual cue. So the question is, are there more efficient things that provide this visual richness and spatial cues that are less expensive? And the answer may be no. The only thing we know about so far where that is definitely true is ambient occlusion. So what are the 10 cousins of ambient occlusion we should have is my question. And maybe they're none. But it took us long enough to come up with ambient occlusion. I do wonder if there's some other things out there. Okay, so this is the most disturbing slide in here. Is the old way, like everything all of us have ever learned before 3 years ago, going to be modified so that we have an AI post-process and maybe an AI to help clutter or something like that? Or is it going to be entirely replaced? Now, I can run the clock out, but those of you who are younger should worry about this. And so here's what's possible. A possible future is no one in this room will ever again write an algorithm. You will only make up loss functions. Now, that's not actually that terrible thing because we're often doing that anyway in how we tune our algorithms. But I'd start thinking hard now about what are the right loss functions for graphics? Because if you can come up with that, you can probably gain a lot of efficiency, and it can address some of the issues I had in the last slide. So what are the seeming constants of the last 50, 60 years of graphics? Okay, elegance of brute force wins. Brute force is good. I think this term was come up with first by Kurt Akeley. I heard it a lot around back in the day, all from NVIDIA people. Special purpose hardware good. And we're drifting away from it a little bit, so it'd be interesting to hit that again. Physically based assets good. Here's the most surprising one to me. C++ has got a 40-year total domination and running strong. That's what I code in today. It's unbelievable. I won't say whether that's good or bad. I just will say it's amazing. The frame rate has been remarkably constant. And where are we headed? So I'll let you read that. The one that really concerns me is where do we get loss functions from? You go to any of these AI papers, it's what's the loss function? What's the training set? What's the architecture, the neural net architecture? The loss function for us graphics people, I think, is where the action really is. I don't think we're very good at thinking about this yet. So that might be my other thing I would do right now if I were just starting a PhD thesis. Final slide. I thought I should make, because basically I haven't really said anything about where I think things are going. I've said where I think things might go. So I have a bunch of predictions. I only make one, and I pick the one that I think will have the most negative reaction from the room. So here is my prediction. We can do all this real-time ray tracing on a desktop GPU. Cyberpunk looks freaking amazing. But I think baking will always be with us. So when this guy, whatever he takes out of that oven, I say that most of the software will still have light baked in it, because most of the people out there in the world are going to be running on 10-watt systems. So yes, ray tracing will also always be with us. And if you want to do predictive rendering, you will go buy a $5,000 computer and you will do this amazing stuff. If you want to deploy a game to 100 million people, I think you're going to use baking. I think there are other reasons baking will survive other than efficiency. I actually think baking, in many ways, is better. So I will leave with that. We can have that discussion at the reception tonight. But just say to yourself and say to all your friends that Pete says baking will always be with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Very inspiring, very nice talk. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions, comments.
And what did I get wrong? Is there anything factually wrong in there? I'll be shocked if the answer is no.
Thoughts? Yeah.
Frame interpolation has come back recently? Is that what you said? Mm-hmm. So could you repeat that question a little more? I got the frame interpolation part. So frame interpolation, actually, I have not read anything about since the 1980s. So in-betweening for film was like a thing. I think that Lavoie did some papers on like Hanna-Barbera cartoons back in the day, Flintstones and stuff, and it worked. But they had like 2 frames they were interpolating between, and the challenge of real-time graphics, of course, right, is you have an asymmetry. You don't have the next frame. But TAA is kind of doing frame extrapolation, right? So one question I would have too is, actually I'm just now confused straight up. So if Joseph wants to do 240 frames per second or 1,000, very noisy, and just not do any smarts, just have pretty crappy frames, but you do temporal integration with your eye. And then a more hardcore person wants to do 30 frames per second, and then really even do 15 and do really careful interpolation, because you have a lot of time then. These seem like very different philosophies, let alone the algorithmic thing. I'd say it's entirely empirical. Since I predicted TAA was a terrible idea, I don't want to speculate too much on this one, but I see your point, that smarts, real smarts in the interpolation could be good. Aaron.
I think training is the new baking.
Training is the new baking. Yeah, that totally could be. Bill Thompson that I had in here, he kind of was pursuing something like that, but not quite with AI. He was like, all this indirect lighting stuff, no one can tell if it's right, but it has certain patterns. You know, it gets lighter into the corners or darker into the corners. And so he was kind of used his own neural net to infer what the patterns of realism are. And I would say some of those final things I was kind of vaguely hinting at, which is maybe hardcore physically based rendering isn't what we need. We just need the right visual richness to have a compelling experience. That would seem to help training. Like training will get simpler if we get better loss functions. So I'm not going to argue against you on that.
What about baking with NeRF or baking with a...
Baking with NeRF? Now, a baking, probably reviewers won't like anything with word baking in it. So I would combine NeRF with some other word, but
Mm.
But if we can find a synonym with baking, I'm with you. Pre-computed global illumination via NeRF. But NeRFs actually, you know, there's a lot of patterning in them. I hadn't thought about it, but if you just went and took NeRFs of many scenes, there's a lot of information about what are the characteristics of rich lighting in scenes. That might be just a great training set, is measured NeRFs of real environments. Because it does just give you a light field in the room, right? Oh, this is a good idea.
Something
Yes.
else?
Yeah.
That he has bad functionalities, features, and we cannot exceed. But he also said that the hedgehog has really bad functional features as well. They're dumb, they have small feet.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You read my hedgehog blog post.
And they did not get extinct yet.
Okay. This I can't answer. So I think computer scientists make this mistake constantly, and I would say this is the repeated mistake I made throughout my career, is thinking your intuition is good. So you say, oh, this is a very elegant algorithm, so therefore that's what should win the day. Oh, I don't like this one because it seems inelegant. So quick sort bad, merge sort good. And you often are just wrong empirically. And so the blog post he's alluding to is the hedgehog just seems like the crappiest design for an animal ever, because you invest all your resources into these thick spines, very small brain, incredibly all-in-one, 100% all-in. You'd think evolutionarily this would make you very vulnerable to changing conditions, and yet it's like the super creature. It hasn't had to change this design in like 40 million years or something. And instead, you would think something like that saber-toothed tiger with its big brain and super teeth that can cut into anything would be awesome. And it turns out it was very vulnerable. I would say this is pretty similar to the algorithms we have, where it's like, why do triangle meshes survive? It's just amazing, really. Oh, point-based rendering, that's very elegant. It's just very unintuitive what wins. And so I think we just have to be super empiricists about what wins and not try to fight it too much. We also have to be aware, though, that ecosystems change. So we as a field over-abandoned neural nets, right? And then it's just our tendency as researchers to go all in on what's winning right now. So ironically, I think the computer vision field, which rejected every neural net paper it could get its hands on for 30 years, now will reject competing things to neural nets. I don't think they like internalize the lesson of their discipline, which is kind of the extreme case of some dead algorithm coming up from the ashes and just taking over the world. And we should be open-minded to that happening to us. And so I guess that was really where my baking will always be with us statement comes from, is I think that's something what we're thinking of as dead. I also, just seeing how the artists work, I've become a real just emotional fan of baking, so I'm also committing the crime I'm talking about of using my intuition.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. We have a banquet soon, so thank you very much. Let's.